Fetch my bags, girl. The grey hard case and the garment bag, and mind the creases this time. Colonel Osric Falgate said it without turning his head, the way a man says a thing he has said to 100 people who were paid to obey it. He was standing at the curb outside the passenger terminal at Wheeler Sac Army Airfield at 07:14 on a February morning, cold enough to make the jet fuel smell sharp, and he pointed one gloved finger at the woman in the plain grey field coat, as if she were a bellhop the army had thoughtfully left running. The woman did not move toward his bags. She looked at him for a moment, the way you look at weather you have already decided to walk through. Around them, the little crowd at the curb went quiet, in the particular way crowds go quiet when a senior man raises his voice at someone he has decided is beneath him. A specialist froze with a duffel half off his shoulder. A civilian contractor pretended to check her phone. Nobody stepped in. Nobody ever steps in at that exact moment, which is the whole reason that moment exists. Falgate mistook the stillness for slowness. To a man like him, a person who did not immediately jump was a person who had not understood the order, and a person who had not understood was proof of everything he already believed about who the army was letting in these days. He sighed through his nose. He tapped the grey hard case with the toe of his boot, twice, the way you'd nudge a dog off a couch. "I'll say it slower," he said. "The bags. There's a good girl." What Colonel Falgate did not know, what the specialist did not know, and the contractor did not know, and the driver idling the black sedan behind them did not know, was that the woman in the grey field coat outranked every soul on that airfield by 2 full grades. The coat had no visible rank on it because she had not yet changed into the uniform folded in her own bag, and because she had come in quiet on purpose. Vella Dressel had spent 31 years learning that the fastest way to find out how a command really ran was to walk into it as a nobody and watch who barked at the nobodies. She did not fetch the bags. She did not correct him. She let the silence go a beat longer than was comfortable, and then she said, "You should carry your own creases, Colonel," and she walked past him into the terminal. Who was she, and why wasn't she afraid of a colonel with a voice like a slammed door? That is the whole story, and it does not end where you think it does. Before we go any further, do me one favor. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and tell me one time somebody looked at you and decided they already knew exactly who you were. I read them. Let's see how far this one travels. Now, back to the curb, because the bags matter more than you'd think. Falgate watched her go through the glass doors and felt the specific insult of being ignored. He was 52, a full colonel, with 26 years in, and he had built his entire idea of himself out of being the loudest correct man in every room. He had command of the 3rd Sustainment Brigade, which is a fancy way of saying he ran the beans and the bullets and the fuel and the boots for the better part of a division, and he had run it the way he ran the curb, loudly, and by deciding early who was worth his attention. He turned to Master Sergeant Cade Fenaway, who had ridden up from the motor pool with the sedan and who was standing very, very still. "You know that woman?" Falgate asked. Fenaway did know her. Fenaway had done a tour at Fort Bliss 9 years earlier, where a then-lieutenant colonel named Dressel had walked into a warehouse that 4 different officers had signed off as fully mission-capable, and in under 2 hours found 41 pallets of expired combat application tourniquets stacked behind a good pallet at the door, the whole lot rebadged with fresh inspection stickers to hide the dates. Fenaway had watched her not raise her voice once. He remembered the number, 41 pallets. He remembered because she had made him count them himself, so that the count would be in his handwriting and not hers. "I've seen her before, sir," Fenaway said, which was true, and was also as far as he was willing to walk out onto that particular ice. "Well, she's rude," Falgate said, and picked up his own bags, and hated every step of it. Fenaway said nothing. He carried the memory of Fort Bliss up the steps behind the colonel like a live round in his pocket, and he thought, not for the first time that morning, that some men spend their whole careers being loud right up until the one day the room is quieter than they are. The reason Vella Dressel was at Fort Drum at all was a stack of paper that should not have existed. 6 weeks earlier, at a folding table in an office 2 states away, she had signed for a job the smart officers spend a career trying to avoid. She was the incoming Inspector General for the Corps, a 2-star billet, and her first tasking was a readiness inspection of the 3rd Sustainment Brigade, because for 2 straight quarters, the brigade had reported its cold weather stocks as green, fully ready, and for 2 straight quarters, a small honest number in the fine print had not matched. It was not a big number, just the kind a busy staff officer's eye slides right past, but Vella Dressel's eye had stopped counting things at the level of, roughly, a long time ago, somewhere back around 41 pallets, and the number bothered her the way a wrong note bothers a person with perfect pitch. So she had come north early and quiet, in a grey coat with no stars on it, to see the brigade the way the privates saw it, before anyone had a chance to paint the grass. The uniform in her bag had 2 stars on each shoulder. She would put it on at 0900, in a conference room full of the brigade's officers, and let them find out the way rooms in this niche always find out. But that was still 2 hours away, and 2 hours is a long time to be a nobody in a grey coat, and she intended to use all of it. She checked in at the visitor's desk under her own name, which meant nothing to the private behind the counter, who called her ma'am and gave her a temporary badge and pointed her toward the wrong building. She did not correct him either. She walked the long way, across a motor pool skinned with black ice, past a row of heaters that were supposed to keep a bay of vehicles above freezing, and were instead humming to themselves in an empty room, warming nothing. She stopped and looked at the heaters for a while. She was good at looking at things for a while. Then she took out a small green notebook and wrote down the time, 0731, and the bay number, and one word, which was cold. She would need that word later. By 0820, Colonel Falgate had reached his office and been handed his morning brief, and the morning brief told him that a 2-star Inspector General would be arriving that day, and that his readiness figures had better be perfect, and he had smiled the smile of a man who has already decided the outcome. His numbers were green. He had signed them green himself. He had a habit of signing things green, and then daring anyone junior to make them any other color. He did not connect the incoming general to the rude woman at the curb. Why would he? In his mind, the general was a man. Generals were men, in the way weather was cold, and colonels were loud. It was simply how his world was arranged, and he had never once been given a reason to rearrange it. He told his aide to make sure the good conference room was warm, and the coffee was fresh, and the readiness slides were ready, and he went to stand at the window and rehearse being impressive. Down in the motor pool, Vella Dressel was on her 3rd bay, and the 3rd bay was worse than the 2nd. A sustainment brigade in a cold place lives and dies on its cold weather kit. Fuel additives so the diesel doesn't gel. Arctic sleeping systems so a soldier on a range at -20 doesn't lose fingers. Casualty heating blankets for the aid stations. It is boring, and it is the difference between a rough field problem and a row of frostbite casualties, and Vella Dressel had spent enough of her life at the boring end of the army to know exactly which shelves to check first. She checked them, and the shelves said one thing, and the paper said another. The paper, the same paper Falgate had signed green, said the brigade held 600 Arctic sleeping systems, serviceable, on hand. The shelf held a neat stack of boxes 3 deep along the front, and behind the front stack, where a man in a hurry would never look, the shelf held empty air and a tarp. She counted the real boxes. She counted them twice, and then she found the master sergeant from the curb, Fenaway, standing at the end of the aisle, looking like a man who had been hoping she wouldn't get this far, and she handed him her notebook and a pen. "Count the front stack, and then count what's behind it," she said. "Your hand, not mine." Fenaway counted. His jaw worked once. He wrote a number on the shelf and a number behind it, and looked at the 2 numbers and understood, in the way you understand a thing your body already knew, that he had just written down evidence of a lie a colonel had signed his name to. 211, not 600. 211 serviceable Arctic systems for a brigade that had certified 600 and was 3 days from putting a battalion on a range in the worst week of a drum winter. "When was the last full inventory, Master Sergeant?" she asked. "October, ma'am." A pause. There was a follow-up scheduled for December. It got cancelled. Who cancelled it? Fenaway did not answer with a name. He answered with his eyes, which cut once toward the ceiling, toward the second floor, toward the window where a colonel was rehearsing being impressive. And that was answer enough for now. Vella Dressel took the notebook back, tore nothing out, added nothing, and closed it. "Thank you," she said. "You did that right." And she watched something in the man's shoulders come down a 1/4 inch that nobody who wasn't looking for it would ever have seen. She had 90 minutes until she was due upstairs. She spent them the way she spent everything, precisely. She photographed the shelf and the tarp and the empty air behind it, with a time-stamped camera, not her phone. She logged the bay heaters that hummed at nothing. She pulled the December cancellation memo from the property book office, and there at the bottom, in a colonel's confident scrawl, was the initial that cancelled the count that would have caught the gap. O.F. She did not gasp. She did the arithmetic instead, the cold arithmetic of what 600 boxes on paper and 211 boxes on a shelf meant for a battalion of kids who were going to be told they were covered. The clock upstairs said 08:47. In 13 minutes she was going to walk into a warm room full of officers, and the man who had told her to fetch his bags was going to give her a briefing full of green. She wanted to be in the room for that. She checked her watch, put the green notebook in the inside pocket of the grey coat, and took the stairs. She stopped once, on the landing between floors, where a window looked down on the motor pool she had just walked. There was a ghost that came to her on stairwells like this one, and she had stopped fighting it a long time ago. A staff sergeant named Farron Dellinger, 26 years old, dead, not from a bullet but from a certificate. This was 14 years back. Another cold place, a different lie, on a different shelf. Somebody had signed a fuel report green, so the convoy would roll on schedule, and the additive had not been in the drums, and the diesel had gelled 40 miles out in the dark, and the trucks had stopped in a place where trucks were not supposed to stop, and Tolliver had been in the third one. Vella Dressel had been a captain then. She had signed for that convoy's readiness herself, off a report she had not walked, because she had been busy, and the number had looked fine, and a colonel had wanted it green. She had not been the one who lied. She had been the one who trusted the lie without going to the back of the shelf. And there is not, in her experience, a great deal of moral distance between the two. She did not cry about Farron Dellinger on the stairwell. She had never once cried about him where anyone could see. She just let the weight of him settle across her shoulders for the length of one breath, the way you shoulder a ruck you have carried so long the straps have worn grooves, and then she straightened under it and kept climbing. Every green report she had ever refused to sign without walking the shelf herself. Every notebook she had ever made a sergeant fill out in his own hand. Every cold morning she had spent as a nobody in a grey coat counting boxes a general was not supposed to touch. All of it traced back to a diesel truck stopped in the dark. That was the whole of it. She counted things now so that no captain 14 years from now would have to carry what she carried up a stairwell. She reached the second floor at 08:58 and let her shoulders come down a quarter inch that no one would have seen, and opened the door to the conference room. At 08:55, the good conference room had gone warm, and the coffee was fresh, and Colonel Osric Falgate stood at the head of the table with a laser pointer and a slide deck that was, from top to bottom, a lie told in the language of the confident. His staff filled the chairs, majors and captains who had learned that the smart move in Falgate's brigade was to nod. His deputy, Lieutenant Colonel Dessa Fenmore, sat at his right hand with a stack of the readiness reports squared to the table edge, and she was the only person in the room whose stomach was not calm, because she had raised the cold weather numbers to Falgate twice in December and had been told, both times, to stop finding problems above her pay grade. The door opened at 08:59. An aide leaned in and said, "The Inspector General, sir," and Colonel Falgate turned with his best impressive face on to greet a 2-star general and watched the woman from the curb walk into his conference room wearing a Class B uniform with 2 silver stars on each shoulder and a 2-inch strip of ribbons that started with a combat badge and did not get less serious from there. The laser pointer went off in his hand. He did not turn it off. It just stopped, the way a heart skips, a small red dot sliding down off the screen and onto the carpet, forgotten. Nobody in the room moved to stand until Lieutenant Colonel Fenmore said, quietly and clearly, "Room, attention," and then 30 chairs scraped back at once, and 30 officers came to their feet, and Colonel Osric Falgate stood at attention in front of the woman he had, 90 minutes earlier, called girl and told to mind his creases. She let them stand. She did not tell them to sit right away. She walked the length of the table, unhurried, and she stopped at the head of it, next to the colonel, close enough that he could not pretend she was talking to someone else. "Colonel Falgate," she said. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It was the only voice in the room. "At the curb this morning, you asked me to fetch your bags. I want to make sure I have this right for the record, because there is going to be a record. Did you, at approximately 07:14, order the incoming Inspector General to carry your personal luggage?" The stars on her shoulders were the smallest part of what had just changed in the room, and every officer at that table understood it at the same moment. The stars had only opened the door. What walked through it was the notebook in her pocket, and the shelf in the photograph, and the difference between a colonel who was rude and a colonel who was in trouble. "Ma'am," Falgate said, and his voice had gone to a place it had not been in 26 years. "I did not know." "No," she agreed. "You didn't. You didn't know a great many things this morning. That's what we're here to fix. Take your seat, Colonel. You're going to want to be sitting down." He sat. The whole room sat. And Vella Dressel took the clicker out of his hand, not roughly, just took it, the way you take a tool from someone who has been using it wrong, and she put up her own slide. It was a photograph, a shelf, 3 boxes deep at the front, and behind the front stack, a tarp, and a whole lot of nothing. A timestamp in the corner read 0819. Under it, one line of white text that read, "Arctic Sleep Systems, certified on hand 600, actual serviceable 211. "Before I arrived," she said to the room, "this brigade certified, twice, that it held 600 serviceable Arctic sleeping systems. I counted 211 this morning. I did not count them alone. Master Sergeant Fenaway counted them, in his own hand, in this notebook, at 0808, and initialed the count. She held the green notebook up, closed, and set it flat on the table, where everyone could see it, and nobody could touch it. So we don't have a disagreement about arithmetic, we have a different problem. She let that sit. Nobody breathed. Down the table, Lieutenant Colonel Dessa Fenmore was staring at the photograph like a woman watching a thing she had said out loud in a locked room finally get spoken in the open. 3rd Battalion goes to the range Thursday, the general went on. Low that night is forecast at -19. On paper, every soldier out there is covered. On the shelf, 389 of them are not. That is not a paperwork error. A paperwork error is a typo. This is a certified statement of readiness that does not match the building it describes, on a shelf where the difference is fingers and toes. She clicked again. A memo, a cancellation, dated December, of the very inventory that would have caught the gap, and at the bottom, enlarged so the whole room could read it, an initial in a confident scrawl. OF. Colonel Falgate, she said, without heat. In December, Lieutenant Colonel Fenmore recommended an off-cycle inventory of the cold weather stocks. That inventory was cancelled. Whose initials are these? The room did not look at the screen. The room looked at Falgate. And Falgate, who had spent his whole career being the loudest correct man in every room, discovered in that moment that there is no volume loud enough to shout down your own handwriting. Mine, he said. She did not raise her voice. She did not take him apart. She had learned, somewhere back around a warehouse at Fort Bliss, and 41 pallets of expired tourniquets, that the loud way of doing this was the weak way, and that the strong way was to make the truth so plain and so heavy that the man had to carry it himself. I'm not interested in humiliating you, Colonel, she said, and she meant it, and the room could hear that she meant it, which was somehow worse for him than if she had screamed. I've read your file. 16 years ago you ran the best forward logistics element in the theater. You kept a task force fed and fueled through a winter that killed the unit next to yours, and you did it because you counted things yourself, with your own hands, and you didn't sign anything green that wasn't. I know that man. I need that man back in this brigade by Thursday, because Thursday there are 200 kids going onto a range in the cold, and the only thing standing between them and a row of frostbite casualties is whether the officers in this room decide to start telling the truth about their shelves. She let the silence work. So here is what is going to happen. Not the part where you're in trouble. You're in trouble. We can both take that as read, and the record will show what the record shows. Here is the part that matters. You have until Thursday morning. I want a real count of every cold weather line in this brigade, done in daylight, by name, initialed by the soldier who touched the box, not by a staff officer who trusts a spreadsheet. I want the gap sourced, or the range moved, and I want Lieutenant Colonel Fenmore running the count, because she is the one person in this brigade who already told you the truth once and got told to stop. Colonel, you are going to help her fix a problem you created in front of the people who watched you create it. That is not a punishment. That is the job. Do you understand me? Yes, ma'am, Falgate said, and something in the way he said it was different from the man at the curb. Not broken, emptied out, maybe, of the thing that had been standing where the truth was supposed to be. Good, she said. Then we agree on the important part. She picked the green notebook back up off the table, and the room let out a breath it had not known it was holding. But she was not done, because the thing about a shelf that is missing 389 boxes is that the boxes went somewhere, and Vela Dressel had spent 31 years learning that a lie about a number is almost never lazy. It is almost always covering for something that moved. That afternoon, she and Fenaway and a warrant officer from the Property Book Office pulled the transfer records for the Arctic Systems, line by line, and the records told a story that the green slides had been built to hide. The systems had not been lost. They had not been damaged. 211 were on the shelf, and 389 had been signed out, in a single transaction the previous spring, to a unit realignment with a hand-jammed document number that did not tie to any real receiving unit. The boxes had walked out the door with a piece of paper that looked official and led nowhere. She looked at the document number for a long time. It was 08:45 hours on the timestamp, on a Saturday, when the warehouse should have been empty. She wrote that down too. The time, the day, the number that went nowhere. She was building a thing in the notebook, brick by brick, the way she built everything, and each brick was a fact in someone's own handwriting. Somebody moved 6 figures of army property out a back door and papered it, she said, quietly, to Fenaway. The colonel's a fool who signed green so he wouldn't have to look. But a fool isn't a thief. This is a different set of hands. And Master Sergeant, I want you to understand what I'm asking. I'm going to need somebody who was here last spring to walk me through who had access to that dock on a Saturday, and that somebody is going to make enemies. You already made one today. You want to stop. This is the place to stop. Fenaway looked at the document number that went nowhere, and he thought about a battalion going to the range on Thursday, and he thought about 41 pallets of expired tourniquets at Fort Bliss 9 years ago that a quiet lieutenant colonel had made him count in his own hand, and how nobody who went cold that winter had gone cold because of a lie she let stand. I counted the shelf, ma'am, he said. I'm not going to stop at the count. She almost smiled. She didn't, quite, but something moved behind her eyes, and she let it move, and did not accelerate it, and did not put it away. No, she said, I didn't think you would. The days that followed were not loud. The best work in the army almost never is. It did not go smoothly at first, because a man does not unlearn 26 years of being the loudest correct voice in one warm morning. On the second day, Folgate tried the only move he had left, which was to make the whole thing smaller. He came to Vela Dressel with a memo he had drafted himself, and the memo, called the 211 a records reconciliation discrepancy, and proposed to close it with a signed corrective statement and a training note, the way you close a lost hand receipt or a mistyped serial number. He had used the word discrepancy 4 times in one page. It was a good memo. It was built to make a felony read like a filing error. She read it standing up, in about the time it takes to read a page you have read 100 versions of, and she handed it back to him without sitting. Colonel, she said, a discrepancy is when the paper and the shelf disagree by accident. When someone cancels the count that would have caught it, signs the shelf green, and the missing property turns up in a rented storage unit off-post, the word for that is not discrepancy. You know the word. You spent 16 years being the man who wouldn't sign the memo you just handed me. Take it back. Bring me the count instead. Lieutenant Colonel Fenmore is expecting you in Bay 3, and she is not going to accept the word discrepancy from you either. I made sure of it. He looked at the memo in his hand for a long moment, and then he folded it once, and did not argue, and went to Bay 3. And in Bay 3, when he arrived, Dessa Fenmore handed him a clipboard and a pen, and pointed him at a shelf without a word, and the captains who had learned to nod watched a full colonel do exactly what he had told a lieutenant colonel to stop doing in December. It was the quietest correction any of them had ever seen, and none of them ever forgot it. Fenmore ran the count, in daylight, by name. Falgate worked it beside her, and it cost him something visible to stand in a cold bay with a clipboard while the captains who had learned to nod watched him actually count. But he did it, and by Wednesday night, the brigade had a true number for every cold weather line it owned, initialed by the hands that touched the boxes. The gap that could not be sourced by Thursday got the range moved, 1 week, to Fort Drum's indoor and covered ranges, on the general's signed authority, over the objection of exactly nobody, because there was no longer a slide to hide behind. The document number that went nowhere took longer, because a number that leads nowhere on purpose was built by someone who did not want to be found. Vella Dressel spent Tuesday and Wednesday nights in the property book office with Fenaway and a warrant officer named Dresco, walking the paper backward, one signature at a time, and each night the trail added a brick and dared them to stop. It was Wednesday, close to midnight, when the trail turned from paper into a person. The Saturday transaction had been keyed at a terminal that logged the operator, and the operator was a civilian property clerk named Fabian Foyston, who had worked the dock for 11 years and knew exactly which count was scheduled and which was cancelled and which loading door had no camera on a weekend. Dresco put the login record on the table next to the phantom document number, and the two of them lined up, operator and timestamp, the way a key lines up with a lock. "That's a name?" Fenaway said, quietly. "That's a name," the general agreed. She did not celebrate it. She wrote it in the notebook under the time and the day, another brick, in a hand that did not shake. Then she looked at the two men across the table, both of them tired, both of them well past the hour when this stopped being their job and started being a thing they had chosen. "Before this goes to the agents in the morning, I want to be sure of one thing. Foyston did not do this alone on a colonel's blind eye. Somebody on the buying end knew the boxes were coming. So we do not stop at the clerk. We do not stop at the loud colonel who signed green. We keep walking to the back of the shelf until there is nobody left behind the tarp. Everybody understand what that costs?" They understood. They kept walking. The trail led off post in the end, 40 miles out, to a contractor's rented storage unit where 389 Arctic sleeping systems, army-marked, still in their factory boxes, sat stacked and waiting for a buyer who had already wired a deposit. Vella Dressel did not make the arrest. She was not a police officer, but the notebook she handed to the agents who did make it was so complete, so exactly bricked, timestamp by timestamp, and login by login, and initial by initial, that the case did not so much get built as get read aloud. The number time-stamped the lie. The Saturday time-stamped the thief. The wired deposit time-stamped the buyer. And Fabian Foyston, who had been clever for 11 years in a building where no one bothered to count, discovered what a great many clever people discover in the end, which is that clever only works in the dark. And a woman, in a grey coat, had walked in at 0731 and turned the light on. She stayed at Drum for the range. She stood at the edge of a covered bay on the following Thursday, in the grey coat again, no stars showing, and watched 3rd Battalion draw real gear from a real shelf, each box logged by name. A specialist she did not know handed her a clipboard, mistaking her for a clerk, and asked her to sign for a heater, and she signed for it, in her own name, "Ma'am and thank you," and did not tell him. Fenaway asked her once, on the last cold morning, why she did it that way, quiet, no stars, letting a room decide who she was before she told them. She thought about it for a while, the way she thought about everything, and then she gave him the shelf as the answer. If she had arrived as a general, she said, the shelf would have been full when she got to it. 3 deep, front to back, every box a lie, and a battalion in the cold. The stars found the polished floor and the fresh coffee and the slides built to be looked at. It was the grey coat that found the tarp. Colonel Osric Falgate was not relieved of command that week, which surprised the captains who had learned to nod. He was, instead, made to fix it. The general's report was not gentle, and it followed him, and he knew every day for the rest of that assignment that the 211 was a number the whole brigade could recite. But he counted, after that, with his own hands. He was seen, more than once that winter, out in a bay, at an hour when a colonel had no business being there, initialing a line himself, and the sergeants noticed, the way sergeants notice everything, and the story of the curb got told in the motor pool with a different ending than the one Falgate would have written for himself. Not the ending where the loud man is destroyed, the ending where the loud man is taught and does the harder thing and stays. A story about a curb and a colonel could have ended there, tidy, with the loud man taught and the range moved and the clerk in handcuffs. But the notebook Vella Dressel carried had never once been about a single shelf. It was about who filled the next one, in the next brigade, at the next cold place, and whether that person would walk to the back of it. On her last morning at Drum, she found Lieutenant Colonel Dessa Fenmore in the property book office at 0620, already at it, the true count squared to the edge of the desk, the way she squared everything. "You raised this in December," the general said, "twice. You were told to stop finding problems above your pay grade, and you found it anyway, and you kept the memo you were told to bury, and it's the reason a battalion isn't sleeping in a hole at -19, with a certificate that says they're fine. I read your file too, Colonel." Fenmore did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, which was the right answer. "There's a Corps IG billet opening in the spring," Dressel said. "It's not a reward. It's the worst job in the building. You spend your days walking into rooms full of people who signed things green, and finding the tarp behind the good pallet, and you make enemies of louder people than Osric Falgate, and most of them will never once say thank you. You'd be good at it. You already are." She set a small green notebook on the desk, a new one, blank, the same kind she carried. "Start with the count. Always start with the count. Then keep walking to the back of the shelf. That's the whole job. You want it, the paperwork will find you." Fenmore looked at the blank notebook. "And if I take it, ma'am, who's the first thing you'd have me look at?" Vella Dressel picked up her bag, the one she had carried herself the whole time, and pulled on the grey coat with no stars on it, and stopped at the door. "There's a brigade at Fort Carson reporting its fuel additives green 3/4 running," she said. "The numbers are lovely. Nobody's driven out to the tank farm and looked." She almost smiled again, and this time she let it come. "But that one's for the spring, and it's for whoever's carrying the blank notebook." She did not say whether that was Fenmore. She left it open, on purpose, the way she left everything open, and she walked out into a Drum morning, cold enough to make the fuel smell sharp, carrying her own bags, minding her own creases. If you've ever had somebody take one look at you and decide they already knew exactly what you were worth, and you had to stand there and let the room be wrong about you for a while, then you already understand why she keeps the coat plain. The loudest man in the room is almost never the one you have to worry about. It's the quiet one at the back of the shelf, counting, in her own hand, the thing everyone else agreed not to look at. That fuel farm at Fort Carson is a whole other count, and somebody with a blank green notebook is about to drive out and look. That's the next one, and it's already up on the screen. Go watch it. And before you do, tell me down in the comments, who decided they knew who you were, and how long did it take them to find out they were wrong?